So welcome back, girls. We're about to start week 2, or our step 2 of our mystery quilt. I have loved seeing all your variations. They've been amazing. Really excited to see the finished product in a couple of weeks' time. So for our step 2, we've actually got 2 parts to it. So the first step is making up a 4 patch, which is one of the most simple and basic patches or units of quilting. So nothing too taxing for you for this step. So what you're going to do, if you have if you are doing options 1 or options 2, you should have a remaining 64 3.5 inch squares, and they'll be a collection of whatever prints you have used. If you are doing option 3, you will have all of one colour, so they will be your colour 1 3.5 inch squares, and once again you should have 64 of these, though you will have cut extra for this particular option. So if you have all cut extra pieces, then just make up those few extra units for you. If you're doing option 4, you'll be using colour 1 and colour 2, so you will have 2 different colour options for this. So I'll just show you how to lay them out. They're fairly simple to do, of course. So option 1 and 2, you're just going to have a collection of mixed colours, and they're going to be sewn together into pairs first, and then you're going to sew the pairs together into a set of 4. What I usually do with a scrappy option like this is I just lay them into 2 piles next to your sewing machine. Just grab one, flip it over the other, and sew them together. So all your pairs together first, and then you can be more selective on which 2 pairs you put together if you want to. If you want to plan out every 4 patch, then that's fine too, but it is a scrappy quilt, so a little more random can work out better. So option 3, you will have all of one colour tone. So my sample here is all pinks. So once again, you'll sew them into pairs, and then your pairs will be sewn into 4s. And the easiest option for this is, once again, placing 2 piles by your sewing machine and just flipping over on top of each other to sew. The last one, your option 4. So this is the only one that is not quite so random. So you'll have the 2 colours, and you need to make sure that your 2 colours are in the opposite diagonal corners when they're sewn together. So you can, if you like, sew pairs together once again, because once you have got the same pairs together, these can just be flipped and rotated to then be sewn back into a set of 4. So I'll just head over to the sewing machine and sew a couple of sets together. Now you're going to sew your pairs together. So your pairs of 3.5 inch squares, whichever combination you are doing, or which option. So I just give myself 2 piles of the squares, flip one over on top of the other. If you like, you can do 1 pile and just grab 2 squares at a time off the top, however you feel most comfortable sewing them. I'm going to sew these together with a 1/4 inch seam. So you should have your 1/4 inch seam down pat now, whichever setting you have yours set at that we did in step 1. So you're going to continue sewing that, you know that that's an accurate 1/4 inch. Just grab your next pair. So we're just going to chain piece these through. So you will have 32 pairs to sew together as we're making 16 sets of 4. So I'm just going to do 2 lots. So at this stage, if you want to, you can go over to the iron and just press your seams one particular way. If you want to be more particular about which pairs you put together and you're not sure which rotation you want them to be, then just leave them unpressed for the moment. So once you decide which way you want them to go, just pop them up against the machine. Just give them a finger press. These are still joined together, so that can be an option too. So you're going to flip those on top of each other. Make sure that your seams are pressed in opposite directions. I'm just seeing if that's going to clear for you. So you can see that your seams are then going in opposite directions, so they're nesting nicely into each other. So once again, if you would like to pin at this stage, and some of you will prefer to pin your seams together, I never pin directly on the seam, and the reason for that is if you stitch up to your pin and then take your pin out, what happens most of the time is this seam will then jump across. So then you'll end up with your seams not butting in nicely together. So what I do is once I've got that sitting nicely in and I can feel that, I put a pin just very close on either side of that seam. So what happens now is as you are sewing, you're going to sew up to that first pin. If you're very careful, you can sew across it. Just, be careful that you don't hit a pin, because then you have to change your needle. I tend to sew exactly up to my pin and then take the pin out. And then what happens then is it actually has nowhere to go. So that second pin is holding it in place so that that seam won't then jump. There are pins called fork pins available, which are a two-prong pin. So they do a very similar process to that. So they are available from Clover. But I find just regular pins, and I always prefer a flat-headed pin. I just find it sits nicer when I'm sewing seams through. So make sure that your ends of your squares are lined up nicely, which they should be if your piecing is nice and accurate. You're going to sew that through. So sewing up until you reach that pin, that first pin. Take that first pin out and then sew just over the seam. So that's locked your seam in. Then take your second pin out and then continue sewing. So holding your finger once again at the end to keep that end nice and firm and together. If you prefer to pin at the end and the beginning as well to keep those level, then that's fine as well. Once again, I don't tend to overpin things. I tend to hold them in place. So then once you open here, you'll see that you have a beautifully perfect matching seam nested nicely into each other. So we're now going to head over to the iron, and I'm going to show you how to press these little ones. Now we're going to press the seams. So press that longest seam closed first, and then just ease that open. Then just press those other two seams just gently. Now we want to press this seam just to one side. It doesn't really matter which way you go. There's no right or wrong with this one. Just gently ease that across, turn that over, give that a press from the top. I'm just going to do a second one so that I've got two to show you the next little trick. So that first one closed first, and just gently ease those other two, press those. Press our longest center seam to one side. Pressing again if you want to use a little squirt of best press or flatter or something similar to help flatten that out. Okay, so that's nicely pressed now. So what we're going to do here, just a little trick shown to me by lesser seagull. So what you do is you just lift that center seam slightly, and you're going to split that sewn seam. So you just want to split that down the center where it's sewn, and then your seams get pressed in two different directions. And what you end up with, and I'll just press that so I can show you, is a little tiny four patch in the middle of your block. So then if you feel that, it's very flat. You don't have that bulkiness of that seam that you do when you just press that whole seam in the one direction. So I'll just do that again, and I'll bring the camera in a little closer so that you can see. So just lifting that, you're just going to ease that center open, and you'll see you're just going to split both those little seams that you've sewn, and one will sit one way and one will sew the other way. It takes a little bit to get used to finding exactly where it is, but because you haven't done locking seams at the beginning and the end, it quite easily splits apart, and it's not going to unravel because you've actually got that seam going across it the other way, which has locked that in. So here you can see that cute little four patch in the middle, and then you've got your seams are actually rotating around the block in different directions. Okay, so that's your part one of your step 2 to put together. So you will end up with 16 sets of 4-patch units in whatever option is that you are doing. We're now ready to do step 2, part 2. So with this part, we are going to be using our 8.5-inch squares, so of our coloured fabrics. So we have a collection of those. We should have 32 squares in total, and it will be a mixture of things depending on which option you have chosen to go for. So if you are doing option 1 or option 2, you will have a collection, a mixture of squares. If you're doing option 3, you'll have 16 colour 1 squares and 16 colour 2 squares. If you're doing option 4, you will have 16 colour 1 and 16 colour 2. With option 3, you will have a mixture of colours or a mixture of fabrics in those. And then the same with colour 2. Whereas option 4, you'll only have one fabric of each. So there'll be colour 1 is one single fabric, colour 2 is another fabric. Okay, so the technique A that I'm going to show you, the first one, will work best for options 1, 2 or 3. And what we're going to do is just cut our 8-inch squares into half to create 2 large triangles, and this will give us a more mixture of patterns and colours together. You are more than welcome to do option 2, which I'll show you shortly, which will just give you more repeats of the same pairing. So by cutting your triangles in half or your squares in half this way, you're going to get more of a mixture throughout your whole quilt. The only thing with doing it this way is that you are stitching your triangles together on the bias seam. So it is a little less stable and you can tend to get more stretching. So if you aren't that experienced with quilting, you may like to try 1 or 2 this way, but you'll find the second technique will probably be more a more stable way of you doing it. Okay, so the first step we want to do is cut our squares in half. So getting a ruler that will go all the way across your whole square, lining up directly through the corners on the diagonal, and you're going to cut once across. So I have a layer of 4 different squares here. If you're not that confident with your cutting, you may like to cut less. So 2 I find is quite good for a beginner. If you're more confident, then you can layer more together. If you want to give them a press first, that helps them stick together and stops them moving a little bit. Okay, so once you have those cut, you will end up with 2 of each. Depending on how many fabric options you have chosen, you may end up with 4 of each triangle. But because you have these cut in half, you can then pair them up much more randomly. Okay, so for example, we can put our patterned one here with a blue, and that can go together as a pair. We can then do the pattern here with a mustard, then our purple with a blue, and then our purple with a mustard. So we have 4 different combinations there out of our 4 squares. Okay, it just gives you a bit more variety across the whole of the quilt. But remembering, even if you decide to do it with technique B, you will still get a broad cross across the whole quilt. Okay, so I'm going to head over to the sewing machine now to show you how to sew these together. If you were doing option 3 and you're choosing to cut these in half into triangles, when you're pairing them together, you're going to pair them together in the same colorway. So for example, if you have pinks as one colorway and aquas as the second, you're going to pair your triangles pink with pink and aqua with aqua. You're not going to combine your colors together, you're going to keep them separate. I've just paired mine here and I've just laid them out in a row so that I can just grab them off the top and bring them over to the sewing machine. So if you would like to pin, because this is on the bias and it is a little more unstable, you can pin, so probably with this length. It is a fairly long seam, so make sure that they are lined up accurately. As I said, if one is slightly smaller than the other, don't panic too much. We do have a bit of leeway with these, with our next step that we're going to do with these. Okay, so pinning. Now, if you have a machine that likes to eat the corners of these triangles, and quite a lot of machines do, you just have what we call a tail and an ender. So just a piece of folded fabric, so something, it doesn't have to be this large, it can be much smaller. And what you do is you just run that through first. Okay, so we're stitching with a 1/4 inch seam. Run that through first until the needle is still in that fabric, but it's almost to the end. So it's just giving you that little bit of a lift of the fabric. You're just going to ease that first triangle in and just past that needle until the edge of the triangle hits that needle. And then that will just help feed that across without it going into the sewing machine. Some machines don't do it at all. Some machines will just do it occasionally. It just helps that chance that it may or may not happen if you just have those little tail and enders. Once you've got one going through, then just sew carefully. So be very careful not to overstretch this, because this is very stretchy on this seam here. So just let it feed through and just holding that gently. So once again, sewing that until it's almost at the end, but not right at the end. Then grab your next triangle and then you can just feed that in under through to then just continue straight across. So then just chain piece all of these. So I'm sewing this one without pinning. You can press these together if you like, that helps them stick a little better. Or if you feel you want to pin, then that's fine too. Okay, so you're just going to continue and feed through all of those, and you'll end up with 32 large half square triangles. And you're now going to sew directly down the other side of the line. So your squares will all be still chain pieced together, so just continue and feed them all through until you have done all 16 of them. Now you've sewn your 2 triangles together, we want to press them. So you want to press that closed first. Now because this edge is on the bias, and as you can see it is quite stretchy, so you need to be very gentle with the iron. So I often find a bit of best press or a bit of starch just to give a bit of body and a bit of firmness to your fabric, so that will actually help it stretch a little less. So you want to press it so that it's almost dry, so pretty close to dry, so that it's added that firmness to your fabric. Then you're going to just gently ease that open, and I often just like to finger press this open first before you get to the iron, but once again be very gentle as it's quite stretchy. So then just gently lift and nudge open with the tip of your iron. Then lift and press. Add a little bit extra best press. And then give it a good firm press. Okay, so just taking your time, being gentle with that bias seam. Okay, I'll just redo another one. So just a little squirt. Press that so it's almost dry. Either finger press or just gently, very lightly ease that open with the iron. Okay, and then lift and press to get that flat. And then if you feel it needs another squirt of best press, that one's actually sitting nice and flat, so I won't need to do that. Okay, so that's how to press those large ones open. Now I'm going to show you doing your half square triangles with the second technique, so technique B. So once again, just checking to see what squares you need to pair together. Options 1 and 2 are going to be mixed. Options 3, you're going to keep your same colorways together. And now we're doing option 4. So we're going to do option 4 in this technique because the other technique didn't really make any sense because we're only using 2 fabrics in this option anyway. So you're going to be pairing a color 1 with a color 2. And then once they are sewn and cut apart, you're going to have a triangle of color 1 and a triangle of color 2. So the second technique, we're drawing a line across the back of our squares. So there's a couple of different ways I'm going to show you. So the first way, just going to grab a straight edge and a marker of some sort, so blue wash away marker, pencil, chalk pencil if you have that one, and you're going to draw from corner to corner. So basically from point to point directly across the diagonal. So basically that cutting line that we cut before when we cut the triangles in half, you're going to be drawing a line on that. Okay, so that's one way that you can draw your line. And then when we sew, we're going to be sewing a 1/4 inch seam allowance on either side of that line. The second way is you can draw your 2 sewing lines on there. So this is a new little ruler, Creative Grids ruler, that I picked up the other day. So it's a 1/2 inch spacing, and it has little gaps down through the center for your center line. So with this spacing, you want to line up your corner at either end. So this will take a square up to probably 10 inches, 10-11 inches across, right from corner to corner. And once you've lined up those points in that space, you're going to draw a line on either side of the ruler. So down both sides of the ruler. So that side. And then on the second side. Okay, so these are your actual sewing lines, and then when we cut, we'll just measure 1/4 inch in from that, and we'll cut directly through that corner after we've done the sewing. Okay, so I'm pairing option 3 here, so I'm going to be pairing pink with pink, and this one will be aqua with aqua, or green with green. Okay, so if you're doing option 1 and 2, then you'll just mix up your squares as much as you can. If you're doing option 2, you will have repeats of some of the squares. So when you pair them, make sure you pair them with something different. So you'll have 2 options to pair them. So make sure that you mix that up and don't sort of do the same pairing, because you'll end up with a lot of the units which will look the same. Okay, I'm going to head over to the sewing machine and show you how I'm going to sew these 2 together. The first square I'm going to sew is the one where I've drawn the line directly through the center. So I've only drawn on one line. I'm then going to have my machine or my foot set so that it is at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So if you have a guide, then your guide is going to run down the edge of this line. If you have a foot like this one, then you're going to just run the edge of the foot. So when you start sewing, where your needle is set, it's going to sew a 1/4 inch on this side of the line. Okay, so you're going to make sure that line stays on the edge of your foot as if it would be the edge of the fabric. And you'll sew straight down to the other end. If you'd like to pin those 2 squares together, then you can do that. A couple of pins on either side of that line will hold that in place. If you want to press those together so that they stick a little bit, then you can do that as well. It's up to you what you want to do. So once you've sewn one through, you're then going to grab the rest of them and chain piece them through until you get to the last one. So then when you're at the last one, if you just raise your foot and just raise your needle and bring it around, so then go back down to, so you're going to start at the last one that you sewed, and you're now going to sew directly down the other side of the line. So your squares will all be still chain pieced together, so just continue and feed them all through until you have done all 16 of them. With the other option, so the square that you have drawn 2 lines on, I always like to use a foot that I can fully see the line that I'm sewing on. So this one I have in here is a little bit closed. It does have a line down through that center, so you could always put your needle in the center position, and then you will see that running directly down through the line. The other option is to use an open toe foot. I'm just going to swap my foot over. So you want your needle in the center position, so if you've adjusted that to the side to get your 1/4 inch seam, then you'll just move that back into its center position. You will line up, doesn't matter which side you sew first, so you're going to sew directly on the line for this technique. So down one side. So once again, chain piecing them through. Keep going through until you've got all 16 squares done. You'll then do the same as we did with the last one. Lift, bring in that last square that you just finished. And then start sewing down the other side. Okay, so sewing directly on that second line. You can see using this foot you've got full vision right into that line, making sure that you are accurate. And then just keep chain piecing them through until you've finished. So now I'm going to head over to the cutting board and show you how to press and cut this technique. Okay, so now we're ready for pressing. So the first one that we did with the line down the center, pressing that flat first. And at this stage, it doesn't really matter which way you press your seams or which fabric you press your seams to. It's not going to make any difference. But if you were doing this specifically with a background and a color and you want to press towards your color, so this technique, what you're going to do is you're going to place the fabric that you want to press the seam towards on the top, okay? So making sure that that fabric is on the top. Now I always press these units first and I press them open before I cut them. And this is what makes them much more stable and will keep things much squarer by doing it this way. So you're going to then just gently ease that one open. So you can see there's actually no stretch in that seam now because it's still joined together and it's not actually cut apart with that bias. So you're going to give that a good press first. You're then going to flip that one back over, spin that around and press open the other side as well. So doing the same thing. So you're actually setting that open seam now before we do our cutting. Okay, then flick that back. Make sure that you flick it back before you come over and do the cutting. There's nothing worse than cutting off your triangle that you've just nicely sewn together. So now we're going to bring the ruler. We're going to cut directly on that line, so basically from corner to corner. And now because we've already pressed them open, basically our square is pretty flat. But I always go back and just give that another press. And if you want to do a bit of starch at that stage, you can. But because we have pressed that before we've cut it, there's no distortion or stretching. So you find that. Still be careful when you're pressing it now at this stage. But that seam is pretty much already in there, that press seam. So that's already done. Okay, so the next one where we have sewn directly on the lines here. So we're going to press it exactly the same, making sure that you have the fabric on top that you want to press the seam towards. Open that up. Press that flat first, flick that back, spin it around, press the other side. Okay, you can be much, not necessarily rougher, but not quite so, you don't have to be quite so gentle with this one because there's very little stretch in that at all. Okay, so making sure that you flip that back open before you cut. Grabbing your ruler. You're now cutting from corner to corner. So if you lay a 1/4 inch line on one of those sewn lines that you've already done, that's pretty much directly through the corner there. Okay, just take it back over to the iron. Just give that another gentle press. sheet. So you will end up with 32 half square triangle units. So at this stage we don't need to do any trimming, so that's as far as you need to go for step 2. So I hope you have fun. I look forward to seeing everyone's units and the photos of that throughout the week, and look forward to catching up next week for step 3. Thank you, bye.